So you have all of these one-shot, one-dimensional theories of social change, and a lot of competition between them. But my argument is that actual social change occurs through this dialectical move across all of these. It's a co-revolutionary process, if you want to call it that, across all of these dimensions. It doesn't work simultaneously. If one is recalcitrant, then the rest can't really work. And I increasingly started to think that actually if you wanted to critique the history of actually existing communisms, what you would do is you would say they never actually appreciated that dialectic of that transformation. If they'd read Marx in this way and said our job is to take the Marxian theory and actually make it work, not only in terms of building cities but in building new societies, what we would do is we would start to look at all of those elements together. But if you look at all of those elements together, then you need an alliance of forces, of people who understand what's going on in all of those elements. I, as a person, don't work on all of those elements. I work on ideas. Now, Marx kind of said ideas are a material force in historical change. I try to change people's mental conceptions of the world. But I'm not under the illusion that somehow or other that's the only part of the, if you like, the revolutionary message. The other part of it has to be, well, okay, who are the people working on the technologies? Can we have a discussion between, you know, what I'm talking about and what they see as possible? And you're seeing this, of course, going on tacitly in the way in which the internet is being used by the left and appropriated by the left at the same time as it's being appropriated by the right. And there's a big struggle over how these new technologies are going to be used and what they're going to be about. And are they liberatory and emancipatory, or are they just simply condemning us to sort of not thinking for ourselves, but just sitting there all day kind of text messaging and God knows what. I mean, so there are all sorts of issues here. And so for me, I was thinking about, well, let's think about a general theory of the dialectics of social transformation in these terms, and through that dialectical mode of thinking, start to actually think about the transition to something other than where we're at. But this then raises, I think, a very interesting kind of question. People kind of say to me sometimes, well, you know, you like to talk about revolution and revolutionary transformations, and yeah, I do. But then they kind of say, well, but that's impossible. And I say, well, you must be crazy, because capitalism is a permanently revolutionary configuration. And think back across all those elements that I said, and well, I'll do this for my particular society where I was living in 1970, which was just arrived in the United States in 1970. Think about how social relations and technologies in relation to nature hung together, and production systems and all that hung together in the United States at that particular moment in history. And think of the mental conceptions and so on. Then we went through a revolutionary transformation, which is called neoliberalism and neoliberalization and all the rest of it. It didn't go everywhere and it didn't work completely anywhere, you know, but on the other hand, the way all of those elements hang together now is radically different from what it was like in, say, 40 years ago in 1970. In other words, there's been a co-evolution within capitalism, and part of my argument would be that actually capitalism as a permanently revolutionary configuration is perpetually changing all of the dynamics on all of those dimensions. And how all of those dimensions hang together looks very different now from what it was in 1970. That, for instance, the mental conception which kind of says, oh, well, I'm just a poor individual and I can't do anything, as opposed to the kind of social solidarities that could be found all over the place, even in the United States in the 1970s. This was a moment when people had social solidarity around the civil rights movement, around the women's movement. There was the beginnings of social solidarity around the environmental movement. So there were social solidarities all over the place. And then one of the things that then happened was that neoliberalization, the political project, was to destroy all those forms of solidarity and to destroy the mental conceptions that were associated with that. And actually in the middle of this there were these revolutionary figures like Margaret Thatcher, who said very explicitly, I am going to revolutionize the way in which people think about the world. I'm going to revolutionize their mental conceptions. I am going to change their soul. And it was a project that seems to have worked. Because right now we go through this humongous crisis, and if you had done this in the 1970s, there would almost been certainly an uprising in the streets, but actually the response right now has been very, very passive. I mean, you're beginning to see it bubble up a little bit in the strikes yesterday, and it's beginning to come together just a little bit, but instantaneously in say 1970, you would have had people on the streets, mass demonstrations, I mean, all kinds of things. I mean, we have a war going on in the United States, 2 wars going on, and nobody seems to be noticing, compared to the vigorous, very vigorous anti-war movement that finished down the Vietnam War. So, mental conceptions have changed. And how did they change? Well, they changed a lot by all of these other dimensions changing. The technology is changing, the production system's changing. For instance, the deindustrialization of the United States. When I moved to Baltimore, there was something called Bethlehem Steel, and it employed something like 37,000 workers. And now there's a little bit of Bethlehem Steel left, and it employs 2,000 workers. The steel union was the big go-to union in the town. It really, politically, if you wanted to do something, you'd go talk to the steel workers. And they had muscle, they had power. They don't have any power anymore whatsoever. And in fact, the industrial workers don't have any power in the United States anymore because of deindustrialization. All the industry's gone to China. And so, so again, these transformations occur with all kinds of consequences. So capitalism then has to be construed as a radical force which is perpetually changing along all those dimensions and is perpetually revolutionary. And so my argument is, if I'm saying all I want to do is to change the direction of the revolutionary movement. It's not as if I'm introducing a revolutionary movement. I'm just kind of saying, hey, how about going this way rather than that way? And at this particular moment in history, this is a very good moment to say, how about we go this way rather than that way? And then the political question, is how do you then get the mental conception out there that it is possible to do that? It is possible to actually transform. Neoliberalization was not inevitable. It arose out of a political conjuncture of the 1970s in a very specific way. And what was needed at that time was to address certain kinds of problems. Capitalism was in crisis in the 1970s. And it was in crisis big time. And they needed to find a way out. Now, there were various ways out. We could have gone much more socialistic, or we get what we got, which was, the neoliberalization game. But this then raises kind of an interesting question. If those 7 moments which hang together in that kind of conceptual space which I'm building, and all of those moments are interrelated with each other and interactive with each other, what force is it that is making them get revolutionized? And I think the answer here is quite simple, for me anyway, and I'm terribly simplifying about things these days. The answer is, well, it's capital accumulation. It's the perpetual accumulation of capital. Now, people then kind of say, well, you keep talking about capitalism, what is capital about? And I say, well, capital is very simple to understand. It's about using money, which is a form of social power, which can be appropriated by private persons. It's about using money to make more money. Now, there are various ways you can do that. I mean, you can do it, fraudulently, or you can do it through corruption, or you can do it, by robbing people and all the rest of it. So there's a lot of that going on. So you can do it all that kind of way, but Marx kind of made the argument that in a stable capitalist society, there is one way in which it becomes hegemonic in how you do it. And that is, you take some money, you go out into the marketplace and you buy labour power and you buy means of production, and you then choose a technology in an organisational form and you put it to work in the labour process, and you make a commodity, and you then take that commodity to market and sell it for the initial money plus the profit. That's what you do. And that is, if you like, the classic formula that Marx uses to analyse the circulation of capital. Now, there's interesting features of this system, and you can start to say what they are. The first thing is the continuity of it is absolutely crucial. That blockages at any point are going to cause you a crisis. So the continuity is significant. And as soon as there is some break of some kind, then capital gets into difficulties. I mean, I remember this. I moved to New York City about 3 weeks before the events of 9/11. And everything shut down in New York City. There was no movement. You couldn't go through the tunnels, you couldn't cross the bridges, there were no planes were flying. And after about 4 or 5 days, the mayor comes on and says, oh my God, you know, the whole economy is collapsing. We've got to do something. And he comes on and he starts pleading with us. He said, start using your credit cards. Go out there. There are restaurants. Go to the restaurants. You can go to the Broadway shows. You can get into all of these shows you never imagined you could get into right now. Just go out there. And President Bush came on a collective TV advertisement and said, get back flying again. I mean, it's the motion has to be perpetuated. And the continuity has to be guaranteed. We saw similar things when that volcano erupted, you know, and all the flights were disrupted across. I mean, the cost of that was huge. So the continuity becomes absolutely crucial. And the lack, any serious disruption in the continuity betokens a crisis. The second thing you can say about it is that it has to expand. Now, it has to expand for very interesting reasons. At the end of the day, capitalists end up with more money than they started out with. What do they do with it? Now, if there are normal people like you and I, they just spend it and have a good time. But there are reasons why they can't. One is that they're in competition with other capitalists. And other capitalists might take some of their money and expand. And if they expand and you don't, you're not going to be a capitalist for very much longer. So the coercive laws of competition, as Marx calls it, forces the whole system to expand. Then there's a big question, how does it expand? And there we start to see one of the big stress points in the history of capitalism. That is keeping the expansion going. Now, historically, capital accumulation has expanded at a compound rate of about 2.25% per year since 1750. In some decades it hasn't hardly expanded at all, other times it's expanded at 5%. In one part of the world it will expand by 10 or 15%, another it'll be less, you know. So we're talking about an average here. And it's very interesting when you look at the financial press, they all kind of hover around this notion that 3% compound growth is just about adequate for the system to survive without too much tension. If it's less than that, you've got problems. If it's zero, you're in a crisis. So 3% compound growth forever is, in fact, what we're looking at. Now, what 3% compound growth meant in, say, 1970 was finding new investment opportunities for something like $0.4 trillion. Right now, given the size of the global economy, you're going to need new profitable investment opportunities for $1.5 trillion. If you keep the 3% compound rate going, by the time you get to around 2030 or 2035, you're going to have to find new profitable investment opportunities for $3 trillion. Think of it in physical terms. In 1750, capitalism was about what was going on in Manchester and Birmingham and a few other hot spots, and 3% compound growth forever on that looked no problem. But you're now looking at 3% compound growth on what's going on in China, East Asia, in general, in Japan, obviously, much of South Asia, Indonesia and India considerably, all of North America, all of Europe. I mean, this is physically beginning to be a really stressful kind of thing. And one of the arguments I made in the last book is that I think you can see signs since around 1970 that capital is finding it increasingly difficult to maintain its compound rate of growth by producing things. And this is, if you like, one of the barriers which has begun to emerge, which is very difficult to circumvent. So one of the things that I decided to do was to look at this as, if you like, a inflection point in the history of capitalism, in which we're not simply talking about, well, I would like capitalism to be replaced by something else because I'm a, dyed-in-the-wool old lefty or something of that kind, and I can't stand all of the social inequality and all of the environmental degradation and all of the alienation I see around me, those kinds of things. Those kinds of questions have been around for a long time.